balance sheet recession.
And pathology is the perfect word. It's like a sickness in the economy's bones, not just some scratch on the surface. We're basing this deep dive on a really fascinating analysis called the silent freeze.
The silent freeze.
Yeah.
It honestly sounds like a horror movie title, doesn't it?
Well, for a central banker, it sort of is.
Yeah, I bet.
It's definitely spooky when you realize what it means. We're going to explore why, in this specific scenario, all the usual rules in economics just stop working. We'll look at the canonical case, Japan's lost decade.
The textbook example.
The textbook example. And then we're going to pivot to the big question in the room today. Is this what's starting to happen in China right now?
So our mission today is to figure out why free money sometimes fails and what happens when an entire economy decides that survival is, well, more important than profit. Let's start with the anatomy of this thing. How does a silent freeze even begin? Because most recessions are loud, Panic, crashes, chaos.
This starts differently. It almost always begins with the bursting of a massive asset bubble. That could be real estate, housing, or it could be the stock market.
Okay, but bubbles burst all the time. I mean, the dot-com bubble burst, the 2008 housing bubble burst. We got over those. What makes this so distinct from just a bad year?
It comes down to the math of the balance sheet itself.
Yeah.
This is the core concept we really need to nail down, but it's actually pretty intuitive. So imagine a company, or even just a household. On the left side of their books, they've got assets. The value of their factory, their land, their stock portfolio.
Right, the stuff you own that has value.
Exactly. And on the right side, they have liabilities. That's the debt they took on to buy those assets in the first place.
Simple enough. Assets versus liabilities. And the difference is your net worth, your equity.
Precisely. Now, in our scenario, a huge bubble bursts. The value of the assets, the land, the real estate, it just collapses. Maybe it drops 40, 50, even 60%. But, and this is the trap, the liabilities stay fixed. Because the bank doesn't care that your property's worth less. They still want the original loan paid back.
Exactly right. So your assets have shrunk, but your debt is exactly the same. Mathematically, your net worth just gets wiped out. In a lot of cases, it even goes negative. You're completely underwater.
So you're bankrupt. Game over. Right.
Well, this is the really critical nuance that the silent freeze analysis points out. You're technically insolvent because your liabilities are bigger than your assets. You're not bankrupt. Not yet.
Oh.
Because you still have cash flow. The company is still selling widgets. You're still earning a salary. You can still make that monthly interest payment.
I see. So you're walking around, going to work, keeping the lights on, but behind the scenes, you're financially hollowed out.
The source calls this being solvent but impaired. It's this sort of zombie-like state. You're not dead, but you're not really alive either. And this financial state, it triggers a massive psychological shift. This is where we go from math to human behavior. Right. Because if I know I'm underwater, my priorities have to change. I can't just keep going on business as usual, pretending everything's okay.
Exactly. I mean, think about the objective function of a normal business. What do they teach you in business school? What's a company supposed to do?
Maximize profits, grow, take risks, expand, make more money.
Correct. But the source argues that when a company's in this impaired state, that objective function flips on its head. It totally inverts. The goal is no longer profit maximization. It becomes debt minimization.
Survival mode.
It's a race to patch the hole in the hull of the ship. So imagine you're the CEO of one of these companies. You're looking at a balance sheet that says you're basically broke, even though you're still making sales. And then the central bank shows up and says, hey, good news. Interest rates are zero. Here's all this cheap money. Why don't you borrow some and build a new factory?
I'd look at them like they were insane. I don't want more debt. I'm drowning in the debt I already have.
Yes. You say no thank you. You take every single penny of profit you make cash that would normally go into R&D or hiring or new equipment, and you use it for one thing, paying down the principal on your existing debt.
You're deleveraging.
Aggressively.
Yeah.
And this right here explains the silent freeze. The central bank is pushing on a string. They can make money as cheap as they want, but if the entire private sector is obsessed with paying down debt, nobody is going to borrow. The economy just sits there.
That pushing on a string image is so good. I mean, you can pull a string to tighten things, raise rates to fight inflation, but you can't push it to make things go if nobody wants to move.
And this isn't just one company we're talking about. Imagine if everyone starts doing this at the exact same time.
Oh, wow. Yeah, if everyone stops spending and starts just saving to pay off debt, then demand across the entire economy just collapses. My spending is your income. If I stop, you get hurt.
And the recession gets deeper, it becomes a vicious cycle. The source calls this the fallacy of composition. What's smart for one single company, saving money, paying down debt, is an absolute disaster if everyone does it at once.
So this isn't just a theory. The source points to a very specific place and time where this happened for real. We have to talk about Japan.
The canonical case. Japan in the 1990s, the lost decade.
You know, I think a lot of people have heard that term lost decade, but maybe don't know the mechanics. I always sort of pictured it as a 10-year Great Depression with soup lines and misery.
That's the strange thing. It
Yeah.
really wasn't. It wasn't a collapse. It was a freeze. Japan had this massive, massive real estate and stock market bubble in the late 80s. I mean, truly huge. At one point, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were rumored to be worth more than all the real estate in California.
That is just, it's absolute insanity. It's hard to even wrap your head around a number like that.
It was. And then it popped. Asset values just plunged. And suddenly, corporate Japan was underwater. But instead of mass bankruptcies and closures, they just kept operating. They just switched into that debt minimization mode we talked about.
So for years, Japanese companies were just funneling every spare yen into paying back the banks.
For more than a decade, the source points out that even with interest rates at zero, literally free money, private sector lending actually shrank. Companies refused to borrow. They just paid down debt, paid down debt, paid down debt. They were cleaning up the mess from the huge party they had in the 80s.
And the result was just an economy that flatlined.
Stagnation and deflation. Prices kept falling because demand was so weak. It was a silent freeze because from the outside, things looked okay. The trains ran on time, people had jobs. But underneath it all, the engine was just idling. There was no dynamism, no growth.
It's fascinating because it really challenges that sort of arrogance of policymakers, you know? You had the smartest economists in the world yelling at the Bank of Japan, just print more money, lower rates further.
But they didn't get it. They didn't understand that the patients, the companies, they didn't want the medicine. They were trying to treat a liquidity problem, a we need cash problem, when the patient actually had a balance sheet problem, a we have too much debt problem. Two completely different diseases.
Which brings us to today, because the silent freeze isn't just a history lesson. The source pivots pretty hard to look at the second biggest economy in the world right now, China.
And this is where the analysis gets very urgent. The source asks a really uncomfortable question, which is China showing the symptoms of a balance sheet recession right now?
Well, we all see the headlines. Evergrande, Country Garden, property developers defaulting, all these unfinished apartment blocks. It feels like we're watching a slow-motion car crash.
Those are the cracks in the dam. And the source points to some really striking parallels with Japan back in the day. First, a massive buildup of debt, specifically in the real estate sector. Second, a property bubble that has clearly peaked and is now correcting.
And you're seeing that wealth effect in reverse. If a Chinese family's wealth is mostly tied up in their apartment, which is super common there, and that apartment's value drops, they feel poorer. They stop spending.
Exactly. Real estate is the main savings vehicle for a huge number of households in China. If that value gets shaky, confidence gets shaky. The source highlights weak private confidence and deflationary pressure. Producer prices in China are falling. Consumers are hoarding cash instead of spending. It smells a lot like the early stages of that psychological shift from profit maximization to debt minimization.
But is it a guarantee? I mean, China's system is so different from Japan's or the U.S. The government has so much more control. Can't they just order the banks to lend and the companies to build?
That's the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? The source is careful here. It doesn't say China is doomed. It asks whether China's unique political economy can let it dodge the bullet. But the math of a balance sheet is universal. If a developer owes $1 billion and their assets are only worth $500 million, well, they're impaired. No amount of political will can change that arithmetic.
Right. You can't just legislate your way out of negative equity. So, okay, let's play this out. If the private sector in China or anywhere really stops spending and just starts paying down debt, who's left? Who keeps the economy from just grinding to a halt? Someone has to buy things.
You've just hit on the macroeconomic dilemma. The source calls this balance sheet substitution.
Substitution. Okay, so one player taps out, another one has to tap in.
That's it, exactly. If the corporate sector and the household sector stop borrowing and spending, the only entity big enough to fill that demand void is the government, the public sector.
The spender of last resort.
In a balance sheet recession, the government has to run massive budget deficits. They have to borrow the money that the companies are refusing to borrow, and they have to spend it on. well, anything.
Yeah.
Infrastructure, subsidies, stimulus checks, just to keep the total amount of demand in the economy from collapsing.
So when we see government debt explode in these periods, it's not necessarily just reckless politicians. It's almost a mechanical necessity.
The source argues it's an imperative. In Japan, the government spent trillions building bridges and tunnels, some of them literally to nowhere, just to keep money circulating. If they hadn't, Japan's GDP would have probably fallen by 40 or 50%. They were filling the hole that the private sector left behind.
It sounds like the government is acting as the designated driver. The private sector is passed out in the back seat, so the state has to grab the wheel. But that's got to come at a cost, right? You can't just run deficits forever.
Well, Japan's been at it for 30 years now, but yes, the cost is a massive, massive pile of public debt. You are effectively transferring the bad debt from private balance sheets onto the public balance sheet. You're socializing the cleanup.
Balance sheet substitution. It sounds so technical, but that's a huge political choice. It's saying we are going to mortgage the public's future to save the private sector's present.
And that leads to this idea of calcification that the source talks about. This isn't an explosion, it's a hardening. The economy doesn't die, but it loses all its flexibility. It gets stiff.
I like that word calcification. Really captures the feeling. It's not a heart attack, it's more like arthritis.
It is. And think about what this does to interest rates. In this calcified state, interest rates have to stay low forever.
Because the second you raise them,
The government can't afford the interest on its massive debt, and all those recovering companies get crushed all over again. So you get trapped in this low-for-long world.
which is exactly what we saw globally for so much of the last 15 years. It felt like rates were never going up again.
It forces you to rethink what interest rates even are. We think of them as the gas pedal and the brake. But in a balance sheet recession, the pedal is disconnected from the engine. The rate is just this background noise. The real action, the real story, is the invisible repair work happening on all those balance sheets.
It really does reframe how you look at the news. You realize the headlines about the Fed might be missing the actual story. So, okay, let's pull this all together. We started with the paradox.
Yeah.
Free money, but no one wants it.
Which we now know is the classic signature of a balance sheet recession.
We traced it back to the trigger. An asset bubble bursts, leaving companies impaired, underwater, but still operating.
Which then triggers that big psychological shift. The goal changes from making money to just minimizing debt. The silent freeze begins.
We saw how this played out in Japan the last decade, where the government had to step in and spend. And now we're seeing the warning signs of that same pattern in China,